afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Owen Holmes. I am the Associate Vice President Emeritus, lecturer in political science, and the chairperson of the Symposium Planning Committee. We appreciate your interest in the Royce International Symposium. Topic today is unfortunately very timely as we focus on new challenges for U.S. foreign policy, specifically Russia and China. The university is proud to call Ed Royce one of our distinguished alumni. Driven by commitment to public service, passion for international policy, and understanding of complex global issues, former Congressman Royce served Orange County as a member of Congress for more than 25 years, including chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee 2013 to 2019. By establishing this symposium, we honor Ed and his vision as statesman. Without significant donor support, this symposium would not be possible, and the university and the planning committee wishes to thank Schools First Federal Credit Union for their title sponsorship of today's symposium. Let's give them a hand, please. As AVP Emeritus for Government Community Relations, I never miss an opportunity to ask people for money too. So you too can join in supporting these efforts. At your seat, you'll find a flyer printed with a QR code. We're getting with the times. Use your smartphone to contribute and support future international symposia for the Royce program on critical issues. So we appreciate that. Today we've secured a distinguished panel of experts that will provide perspectives about future challenges, and particularly about what's going on today. Our keynote and panelist bios are in the program for your perusal. Finally, allow me to say it takes many people to plan and coordinate a program such as this. In your program is a list of acknowledgments of those that made it possible, and we thank them a great deal. Personally, I want to thank the Planning Committee for their ideas and support. I also want to thank Ed and Marie for making time out of their busy schedules to be here with us. Also, a big thanks to Amy Porter, a good friend, and Ed's former Congressional Chief of Staff for all of her guidance. She's with us today. It is now my pleasure to bring to the podium my good friend and fellow Titan, Ed Royce, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. And I'll be back after the keynote. Thank you. Ed?
Owen, thank you very much. Listen, I really want to express my deep appreciation for all of you who are here with us today. I do want to acknowledge my wife, Marie, who's standing at the moment over here, former Assistant Secretary of State. And I did want to say one thing before I introduce Jim Carafano, and that is I made a few calls around D.C. because there's a Jim Carafano that we know in terms of the academic, but then there's a side to him that those at the State Department and U.S. Institute of Peace and so forth know. One of the individuals I respect there, who has done a lot of work on reconciliation towards in tough situations, let's say, said, you know, when you need to get an NGO out the back door because a terrorist is coming through the front door, sometimes you go to the people with the commitment and the connections that can really get things done quickly in this world. And I said, yes. He said, you go to Jim Carafano, he's a lot more than just an academic. You know, he's a man in the ring in terms of dealing with these crises and sometimes trying to deal with them in real time. And what I wanted to share with you, just going through his background, you know him as a leading expert in national security and foreign policy. He's the vice president of Heritage's National Security and Foreign Policy Institute. He's the author of Brutal War, a study of combat in the South Pacific. For those of you who have studied the island ring chains and the war between Japan and America and our ally Australia, you know a little bit about how hard fought those campaigns were. But in Papua New Guinea and other places where men fought to the very limits of human endurance, Dr. Carafano has caught this story of history. And it's a reminder of what war really is like. Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World, is one of his books. And to put it mildly, what you learn from that book is what you see playing out today in Ukraine. He is the editor of a book series, The Changing Face of War. He served on the Homeland Security Advisory Council under several different administrations, convened by the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army with a master's and doctorate from Georgetown University. He joined Heritage in 2003 as a senior research fellow in Homeland Security and in missile defense. He wrote Esprit de Corps and produced that, which educated the public about veterans affairs. In this capacity, he did documentaries such as Veteran Nation and Why We Fight, 9/11 and America's Longest War. Before coming to Heritage, he was a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment for Washington Policy, and he's a graduate of West Point. He holds a master's degree and doctorate from Georgetown University, as well as a master's degree in strategy from the U.S. Army War College, where he was a professor, and at the National Defense University he taught. He previously served as an assistant professor at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point and as director of military studies at the Army's Center of Military History in West Point. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to introduce Dr. James Carafano.
Wow, what a turnout. Some more people than showed up for my wedding. No, sir, I know this is a serious subject. We should be serious. I'm terrible. First of all, I feel really bad because I feel for the inaugural Ed Royce International Symposium, you should have a really distinguished speaker. I think that would have been really important. And unfortunately, I'm not, maybe the most distinguished speaker Ed could have gotten. But if it's a consolation, I have actually spoken for many distinguished people. No. No, you laugh, but I'm really not making this up. I filled in for heads of state and senators and cabinet secretaries. And in the most important speaking role I ever had, I was filled in for Kiefer Sutherland. So there's that. The most important thing you should take away from today, if you're a student or a member of the Cal Fullerton community, is that if you care about what your parents or your family or community think of you, if you want them to honor and respect you and believe that your life had value, then your ultimate goal should be the shadow of Ed and Marie Royce. These are two of the most incredible public servants I have ever worked with in my entire life. Marie had a career in cutting edge in technology, her work at the State Department, representing America around the world. Her leadership was visionary and impactful. It impacted the lives of women and minorities and communities that knew little more about America than that there was a flag. Her service, her inspirational leadership, her vision, her imagination were incredible. I worked with Ed for years when he was the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And all I could say is if we had just listened to Ed, If you go back and look at those years, on every issue that he focused on and tried to move the ball forward, America would be much more free and safe and prosperous today. He was one of the most important and forceful and strategic members of Congress that I'd ever had the pleasure to work with. And through all of that, he was the definition of a professional, of a gentleman, of somebody that cared about the issues above the politics. So I don't say this lightly. Of course, I'm incredibly honored to be here, but to say that these are the kind of people that we should all aspire to be. And if this university contributes at all to making you anything like these two people, that this country will be incredibly well served. So the other thing I want to say is thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you. You know, for too long we've treated our politics like a buffet table. So you walk up and you go, yeah, I'd like a order of low taxes and give me a SIA school board and sprinkle it with some news about the Oscars because I heard that was cool. And that is not the world that we are living in anymore. Everything around the world impacts everything we do in our communities, at our dinner tables, in our paychecks. And we no longer have the luxury as the people of a democracy who get to decide what our future looks like to think that we can just sit back and focus on the things that we like and ignore the things that are important to our life. I can remember how many times I would talk to people through several election cycles now. You know, I work on foreign policy and national security issues, and they go, well, I'm not really voting on that. I'm voting on, whatever, healthcare or whatever. But the reality is no, you are. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, you are voting for the commander-in-chief. You are voting for the chief diplomat. You are voting for the person who arguably is the most powerful person in the world. And your vote and your voice really, really counts. And so it is so important that all of us care about the issues that impact all of us. And the fact that folks came here today and are interested in this topic, and regardless, I could care less if you agree with me or not, but the fact that you care about caring to me is incredibly important. It says so much of you, and more importantly, it says so much about this community of Cal Fullerton and about what it is to be a Titan. And I just think it says so much about who you are. Because look, no. Because there has never been a more important time for us to take responsibility for our own future and lives and think about the challenges that we face in the world today. So, actually, I didn't know I was giving this talk when I was doing this, but a couple of weeks ago, almost a month now, I guess, I was in Budapest in the days before the war broke out. And I will tell you, it was one of the most surreal experiences I've ever had in my life, because everybody knew or feared that something was going to happen, but nobody knew exactly what. I actually had one of the world's foremost experts on Russia give a talk hours before saying, I guarantee you Putin will not invade Russia. Yeah, that's probably how he feels too. But what was it? But it was, it really, and I knew what it must have felt like to live in 1939. So after the Polish War, there was this period called the Phony War, when everybody declared war on everybody, but nobody actually did anything. And people just sat around for months. And they were just like, well, what's going to happen? And they didn't know really what the future held. And I know in retrospect, we look at you people, like, you're watching one of those horror movies and you go, what is wrong with you people? Like, you're a Jew, you're in Paris, you're in Vienna, in Berlin. Run, right? And I felt what it must be like from their perspective. They didn't know. I mean, obviously, with hindsight, we can say, well, this was the calm before the most horrible storm. They didn't know what was coming. But now I have sympathy, empathy for them, because Europeans, they had no idea. I cannot tell you how many Europeans I talked to who didn't think there was going to be a war or didn't know. The only people that I met with I don't want to tell you who they are, because that wouldn't be fair. It's an off-the-record conversation. So the Finnish state secretary, I didn't tell you his name. A month before the war, he said, Putin's going to invade Russia. I guarantee it. He goes, this is his lifelong dream. He sees it, he will do this. And, I always thought, always believe the Finns, because who knows Russia better than the Finns, because they're right next door. But all the rest of us were not so certain. And So to watch this moment in history unfold before your eyes, when it rarely happens in our lifetime, I think we can all count the number of points in our lifetime where we say, not just that we know this is when moments change. So I do think that we are in one of the most eventful and impactful moments in modern times. And one of the key issues that I think it's going to determine the future is, how do we view Russia and China? Not Russia or China, but Russia and China. The relationship between them. Do we see them as part of a coherent threat to the life and the future that we hold, or do we see them as kind of distinct challenges to be challenged separately? Because that, in many ways, will determine how this relationship unfolds. And I'm a historian by training, and historians get taught, this all that stuff you learned in grade school, that was bunk, right? This great person theory of history, like George Washington and Hitler and Bismarck. That's not real. History is people, right? History is about trends and industrialization and agriculture and why do we just study these people whose pictures are on the wall? And I think we've in some ways forgotten that the reason why we study the pictures on the wall is because many times the fate of all the common people whose history does really matter. Of course it does. But their lives and their future is determined by the decision of a handful of men and women who independently, on their own, listening to no one, not following the trends of history, not saying, what's my legacy in the book, that say, today, I am going to do this, and I am going to change the world. And it's the rest of us, the 8 billion or so, who have to live with the consequences of that. So to not care and study and pay attention to what they decide, I think really does not reflect the reality of how the world turns. And today, as we sit and talk, there are men and women in conference rooms and offices and war rooms all over the world talking about, where do we go from here? And they will make very, very consequential choices. And I think one of the most consequential will be, how do we view Russia and China? I don't think there's a question that the world has changed in the way we view both these powers. No one in Europe today believes that Ukraine is just about the Ukraine. Last week, I think between myself and my colleagues, we probably had 7 different embassy events, some on the record, some off. So probably, maybe you're talking to between us 40, 50 diplomats. Nobody thought that this was just about the Ukraine. I mean, if you heard senior German officials in the last few weeks say things that a couple of weeks ago would have been completely unthinkable. To say, for example, that German defense spending is going to completely change because they just see the world differently than they did a month ago. We had one of the most senior German officials say just yesterday that Nord Stream 2 was dramatically naive and a mistake. And how could they have not seen the danger of Vladimir Putin? So the world recognizes that this is a great destabilizing threat, not just to Western Europe, but it has really global implications. And not just for Russia. In many ways, Russia is China's stalking horse in Western Europe. They both want the same thing. They both want a Europe that is disorganized, divided, distracted. That works well for Russia. It works equally well for China. Ultimately, what Putin would like is to reabsorb the post-Soviet states, to have dictatorial control over Central Europe, to see NATO dissolve, to see the United States withdrawn and isolated. I'm not putting words in his mouth. That's exactly what Putin has said. And he's not just said that. Since 2014, he has consciously and overtly had a plan to move in that direction. That's exactly what China wants. China would like nothing more than to divide up influence in Europe with Russia, to have the United States be alone and isolated. If people really doubt the consequences of these visions, and we can have very good debate, and we will have a terrific debate here. The panel today is fantastic, and it's a tremendous diversity of views that you should really listen to because they're all very serious people. And we can have very different ways to talk about how to respond to this, but you have to understand from their perspective, if their vision plays out to its full expression, what that means for us, and it is not good. I really recommend a book. Gerhard Weinberg wrote the Definitive History of World War II. He also wrote this little book called and he described what the world looked like from each of the major combatants if their side had won. And all you have to do is read the chapters on Japan and Germany and Italy to realize what America would have looked like if they had gotten to do everything they wanted to the world. What it would be like to be an isolated and alone people surrounded by powers that have a completely different concept of how the world should work, where the ideas of human rights and freely elected government and free enterprise are obstacles and ills, not things to be cherished and preserved. Fundamentally, the appetites of Russia and China are no different. Now we can debate whether they have the capacity or the will to exercise those appetites, but they are the same. And for China, it's not just about Europe. The war in Ukraine has also highlighted the conflict between the Chinese and Taiwan, which is another significant kind of frontline issue in the global alignment of power. I think for many of us, they think of Taiwan as, well, this is about silicon chips and democracy and stuff like that. But the reality is, Taiwan is fundamentally important to other countries because it is possibly the most important island in the what's called the first island chain. And so if you think of these islands in the Pacific, it's the vast expanse of the Pacific. An island is really, if it's got any flight, is really a permanent aircraft carrier. If you control an island, you control the sea, potentially the sea and the air around that space. And if you control the right ones in the right places, basically you control all the traffic, all the movement on air and sea. If you control the first island chain, essentially you control north-south traffic in the Pacific. And Taiwan is the key island in that, which is why it was such a key target during World War II. If China controls Taiwan, it essentially blocks many countries. It gets to determine what many countries can do in the Pacific. So for example, the alliance between South Korea and Japan and the United States is basically done because essentially they could deny us access to those places. There's a thing called, if you're really into this, you want to buy my book, you're rich. Price took way too high. But it was called the second island. The second island chain controls traffic east and west across the Pacific. And what's really scary is if you actually look at the list that the Japanese are interested in World War II, and the list that the Chinese are interested in today, the list of islands is exactly the same, and for exactly the same reason. If China controlled the first and second island chains, essentially China would control passage in the Pacific. America would no longer be, without the permission of China, a Pacific power anymore. That's why these competition over these remote islands really are so crucial and vital to us. And so that is another issue that has really come to the forefront. So, look, I think this is the reality of how historians will write about this exact moment today when they talk about the history of how we got wherever we're going from here. And that is that regardless of how you think the world should work, what the strategy should be, if we should exercise restraint or aggression or whatever, the notion that the world is governed by a rules-based order is officially dead. Nobody believes that anymore. Nobody that matters believes that anymore. Even if they say that in a speech, they're not telling you the truth. They don't believe it. We can, and I'm sure Cal Fullerton, a scholar from this university, who write the definitive history explaining why it died. We could have lots of explanations about that, we can debate that, but the reality is we are where we are and there's no do-over in history. But the notion that we came out in the 1990s that rule-based norms would essentially ameliorate conflict and preclude the escalation and kind of major competition and wars that we saw in previous centuries, that hope is gone. It is absolutely gone. What will determine the future, whether it is returning to a norm-based society of cooperation or to something more catastrophic, that will be determined by force. The hard power that people bring to the table to defend and advance their interests. Now, that may result, as it did in 1945, in an order where norms-based systems were adequate, or it may go to a different place. It may go to a much darker place. I don't know. It depends on what we decide. One of the key decisions in how we decide to apply the force and the resources and the ability and the time and the talents that we have will be on how we view to address this competition. To address what I think is clearly acknowledged now, that what China and Russia are they are adversarial powers whose advancement of interests are destabilizing to free nations. And if they are allowed to advance their interests unimpeded, the free world that we know will no longer cease to be. It may be something that they want. It might be something catastrophic. But it won't be the vision that we had coming out of the 1990s. So what do I have? I have a list of things to watch. I don't know what decision people will make, but I think I know the things that they will decide that will make a difference, that will determine how we view Russia and China together, or not. The first one is focus, and it's the focus of the United States. Great friend, Bridge Colby, wrote this fantastic book. Have you ever read it? No? Sorry, Bridge. It's a great book. It's about how the United States should really, the most important thing is to prevent China from getting hegemony in the Pacific, and we should all rush over there and do that, and everybody else should take care of their stuff. I think we're just going wrong, but love the book. Because it frames this really debate, which is where should the focus of U.S. power be? There are a lot of people that argue, some people argue that we should show restraint both places, that we shouldn't be really worried about China or Russia. Some people argue that China is really the main driving power threat, and we should shift all of the focus to the Indo-Pacific, and that we should leave the Europeans and the Middle East and those guys to fend for themselves. Other people argue, no, Europe's really important, and they point to the Ukraine war and say, look at, how can the United States turn back when things like this can happen in Western Europe? So one question is what does the United States do? Sometimes we talk about these shifts in focus and they're rhetorical, we do nothing. Sometimes we actually do some of the chess pieces. That I think is a really issue. Where does America look? Does it look east or does it look west? That's a big question, and it has big implications to get the answer right. And this is what I think is really interesting, because I think we're seeing something that nobody really expected. We all think of America kind of pushing the world and telling the world where it should go. And I think the reality of what we're seeing right now is I'm not sure the United States is going to pick between focusing on the stability of Western Europe and competing with China and Asia. And because the reason for that is because our friends and allies are like these giant magnets. And I don't think this is something that we really anticipated. They don't want the United States to leave their fear. And I think we've clearly seen this in Europe, despite all the talk of European autonomy and going alone, and NATO is brain dead. The first time the balloon went up in Europe and people started dying in big numbers, and people had millions of refugees showing up on their doorstep, the first thing out of people's mouth was, where's America? America cannot lead. We cannot do this without America, and America has to be with us.
And we see the same thing in the Indo-Pacific. You look at the cross of the key allies in the Indo-Pacific, they have lots of plans, they have lots of ambitions. All of them include America being present and engaged. So I'm not sure, in terms of focus, that the United States will ever ignore either theater. But that's a big question, and the decisions that we make there have profound consequences. The second issue, I think, is maybe the most controversial. But it actually might be the biggest and toughest call that we have to make. And it actually might have the biggest consequences of any decision that we make. And it is this debate, or this choice between an aggressive plan for climate action that looks at a rapid transition to renewables and to net zero by 2050 versus the geostrategic need for reliable, affordable, abundant energy that isn't dependent on your adversaries. These programs, each in their own way, as noble as they might be, are incompatible. We cannot do both. And there are lots of arguments about what we should do and can do, but we have to make some very hard decisions. And this is going to be hard. It's hard for us. It's even harder for the Europeans. Climate action in Europe is almost a matter of faith. That these are things that they have to do. We can debate whether this is a political construct or whether this is a realistic environmental agenda. But the reality is everything that they convinced themselves that they absolutely had to do and was completely non-negotiable now seems completely unworkable, undoable, and unachievable. That choice, the choice of how we look at our energy future, is going to be arguably the most consequential geopolitical decision that we make. And it's going to ripple across the entire planet. And it's going to be a tough, tough choice for people, because for many governments, and many of us, we were heading off in one direction, and now we have things that are pulling us in the exactly opposite dimension. And it's going to require people to go back and look at the science, and the physics, and the chemistry, and the politics, and the reality of this issue, and make some really, really hard choices that they didn't want to make. That's going to be a really important one to watch. The really interesting one that old geeky people like me, you guys don't care about this stuff, right? Energy you care about, right? Because you look at the energy bill, right? And you buy a Tesla. But the geeky thing, right, that we love is this kind of what's called, because you have these two separate theaters, sometimes we forget how big the planet is. I think particularly during COVID, where we, a big trip is like going in the refrigerator, right? But, because how often do we get on planes anymore and like fly 18 hours to another part of the world? But first of all, the Indo-Pacific theater is so vastly enormous that we forget sometimes how incredibly huge this thing is. It's like half the planet and half of its ocean. I mean, it is a universe unto itself. And it's thousands of miles away, not just from Western Europe. And then if you want to bring into the challenges and the complications of the greater Middle East, it's two dramatically different theaters that are far apart and be more complicated. I think it's like, do you ever go like on a foreign trip and like you show up with the wrong adapter? When you've got the universal adapter, right? It's got like 15 different prongs on it, right? And it's got all these buttons, but you're in like the Maldives. And it's the one place in the world where it's like they have some 18th kind of thing you can't plug in. This is the problem is Western Europe and the Indo-Pacific have completely different governance and security architectures. They're completely incompatible. And so the question is even if people wanted to think of the challenges of Russia and China in a synchronous way, how would you do that? So what's interesting is what we're seeing is, it's actually being done at the national level. I mean, NATO never doesn't line up well at all. I mean, the closest thing we have in the Indo-Pacific is really the Quad, which is the informal cooperation between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, the four great democracies in the region, trying to synchronize policies and then kind of maybe build out from there. These things just do not connect. So what we're really seeing is interesting innovation at the national level. In Europe, for example, look at the British and the French. Matter of fact, it was just announced today, the British just entered into a new cooperative agreement with Australia and the United States on some air defense issues. So the British are doing that, the French are much more engaged in the Indo-Pacific. Lithuania? Anybody ever been to Lithuania? Anybody Lithuanian? Are you really Lithuanian?
I've been there twice.
You've been there? Okay. So Lithuania wakes up one day and decides, we're going to establish diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Like, who does that, right? And of course, it immediately gains the ire of China, which tries to basically cancel the country, right? And then the Lithuanians turn around and they withdraw from what's called 17+1. So 17+1 is this framework that the Chinese set up to have integrated bilateral relationships with all the European countries. And the Lithuanians essentially walked away from it. It's now 16+1. I mean, so here's this tiny little country making an incredibly powerful statement about policy in Asia. And we're seeing, for example, many countries, not just in Europe, and in other parts of the world, reestablishing diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And we see it the reverse way, too. So, for example, if you go back to European capitals today, you're going to see somebody from Japan, the South Korean, the Taiwanese, all there looking at investment and strategic partnerships and opportunities. India, for example, India has a look east policy. India and the Middle East, its primary interlocutor was Iran for many, many years. Now they have strong relationships with Israel, and they've diversified with other countries. They have much stronger relationships in Europe. So we're seeing this intense activity at the bilateral level. And so the question is, does that mature into something more strategic? From the sense that these individual national efforts, does that actually shift what we in the old days would have called the free world into somehow a coherent view of dealing with both Russia and China? This is a super interesting question. You know, the Chinese, their strategy for Western Europe is basically divide and conquer. The last thing they wanted was unified European positions on China, because they really wanted to deal with countries individually, have them compete against each other, undermine each other, and the notion of a more coherent view of how to deal with China, absolutely the last thing the Chinese want. So that's a really, really interesting fun watch. The other one I'll mention to you, anybody caught Zelensky's speech at the UN today, which was very interesting, completely irrelevant, but totally interesting. You know, basically said the UN should reform itself. Yeah, I think that ought to be a big laugh line. Look, the international organizations are an incredibly important set of instruments to watch to see about how people view Russia and China. You know, we often, as kind of Republicans and Democrats, think kind of diametrically about this, where Republicans hate international institutions, Democrats love them. But the reality is there's a competition going on in international institutions that is preventing them from being kind of the interlocutors that we would really want in global cooperation. We see that with Russia, stalemating things against Russia, but we also see incredible Chinese influence in so many international organizations, personnel, leadership, really trying to shift the organizations to support Chinese national objectives. We saw it with the World Health Organization, we're seeing it with others. So there is no pushback against that. There's no systematic pushback against that. If that changes, that will be another important thing to watch. Security, obviously very important. In Europe, if we never want to see anything like Ukraine again, and I know there'll be some debates on this, we're going to have to shift from a tripwire strategy to a forward deployed strategy. In other words, if you want to deter Russia, you just don't have to show, well, if you cross this blue line, you'll kill some, allied soldiers and will be at war. You want to be able to say, if you cross that blue line, everybody that crosses that blue line will die. That's a very different deterrent structure than we were moving towards. In the Indo-Pacific, it's a very different issue. A lot of people look at the Russian military and they say, hey, these guys really aren't very good. I mean, they squandered all their best troops, all their best ammunition, and they still can't beat the Ukraine. Well, they are good. They're really good at killing innocent people. They're really good at destroying their lives and livelihood. And as long as that is army and Putin is their leader, they can go back and rearm and come back again, and they can destroy somebody else's livelihood and community. So do not believe that Russia will not be a pacing military threat in the future. China is looking to be a peer competitor in the United States. And there's only one reason for that, because they want to get to a situation where when there's a face-off at the OK Corral, The Chinese want to be able to tell the Americans, do you want World War III, or do you just want to back down and let us do what we want to do? And again, these are not the days we're going to see ahead. And the last one, Iowa Graham, if I can remember. I always have these terrible moments. I once gave this horrible speech about, I gave it 1,000 times, about just war theory. He said there are 3 rules of just war theory. And I gave the first 2, then totally forgot the third. Right? And then there's no way around it.
There's one way around it.
Just say
Questions from the audience.
Oh.
And then come back to you. Why don't we do it?
Okay.
Why don't we open it up to some questions, if we could, and Dr. Carafano can answer your questions. Stand up and state your name and your question.
Rob McLean, Department of History. It's time for Germany and Japan to change their constitution. Let's repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is, the time for Germany and Japan to change the constitution? Well, I mean, I think that's totally up to Germany and Japan. I mean, the reality is, there isn't enough deterrent force in the United States alone to deter simultaneously in 2 major theaters at once, right? So the United States, even if is incapable, even if we wanted to, if something happened in one theater and we responded to that, let's say there was an incident in Taiwan and we responded to that, then everybody can do the numbers. If something happened in Western Europe, like in Ukraine, the United States would actually do very little to support that. So what that does say, and especially if the United States doesn't have the freedom to say, well, that theater's yours, you guys got that one, I got this one, there's almost no scenario where the United States can provide extended conventional deterrence without the addition of deterrence from friends and allies. And the flip side is also true, which is they cannot do it themselves. So I have this conversation with my European friends all the time. Like, you want an autonomous European security identity? I get that. What are the 2 threats to Europe? Well, military threat from Russia and the spillover of problems from the Middle East. Independently, Europe is incapable, as a whole, Europe is incapable of dealing with either of those without the United States. So there is no such thing as an independent European security identity. You only can have real regional security in the context of transatlantic community that includes the United States plus allies. Now, how they choose to exercise that, but the reality is allies are going to have to do more to defend themselves. We often talk of this in the context as they do more and we will do less. I think the reality of the modern world, if we want to have a safety net which prevents the escalation into large regional conflicts and regional war, is we both have to do more. Sir.
Hi, Eric Houston. Is there a line where Japan feels that there is no choice but to aim nuclear weapons?
I don't know. This is not a conversation. So the question is there a line where Japan thinks that they have to get nuclear weapons? I don't know. We ran some interesting scenarios a couple of years ago. And one of it was we look at proliferated environments. So we actually did a scenario where Japan, Taiwan, China, North Korea, South Korea, we all had nuclear weapons. And the answer is we always had more. It was really bad. Because the problem was, if you think of like the face-off at the OK Corral, right, where you're facing off against the other guy, and everybody just stalemates. But remember that movie with like Kevin Costner and the other guy, the Open Range? They go into town and like everybody just shoots at everybody, right? Because nobody's sure whose side they're on. That's what happens often when you get to a proliferated environment. So we did some similar role planning in the Middle East where we had a nuclear Iran, a nuclear Israel, a nuclear Saudi Arabia, a nuclear Turkey, Egypt, same thing, very unstable environment. So if you don't want to go into a heavily proliferated environment like that, and you're going to have nuclear competition, which clearly we will with Japan and Russia, The only alternative to that is what's called extended deterrence. And the only way extended deterrence works is it can't have big gaps in it, which means you have to have extended conventional and extended strategic deterrence. Because if you don't have adequate conventional deterrence, then what happens is you very quickly climb the ladder of escalation, and then you fall back on, are you going to use nuclear weapons or not? That's not a place that anybody wants to go. So what you're able to do is deter at the conventional level, and then they realize that because they don't want to escalate to the strategic level either. So to me, this is the real benchmark, right? This is why I use this phrase over and over. We debate budgets, we debate restraint, we debate strategy, we debate weapon systems and all that. But the answer is if you don't have sufficient strategic and conventional deterrence in the face of Russia and China today, then you have an unstable regional environment. And so I think the real question will be how we do extend it. I think it's more interesting when we if Iran gets a nuclear weapon and Israel doesn't go to war with Iran, which it probably will, how do you keep everybody else from getting nuclear weapons? And the only alternative they would have would be to build in an extended deterrence umbrella. How you do that's really interesting and complicated. In Europe today, if we didn't have extended deterrence in Europe today, I wonder if we have as much stability as we do have in Ukraine. So this I think is going to be one of the big issues that we confront. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ward, military matter. Well,
I'm still trying to think of the sixth thing.
it seems like China's a little risk averse with military kinetics because they don't have much institutional memories in Vietnam. So I don't think there's an invade Taiwan, but they might do it in a different way to unrestricted warfare. Other people will try to undermine the country with maybe not kinetic action. What do you think?
So I do think you make a really important point. I mean, Ukraine and Taiwan are very different military operations. You have to cross a big sea to get to Taiwan. That is not an insignificant problem. And you have to do logistics for all that. And this is some very difficult terrain to fight on as well. So it's not necessarily, let's just, and the Chinese haven't fought a big war in a very long time. And the Russians hadn't fought a big war in a very long time, and look how they did. So I do think that's an issue. But this is where, again, I think strategic deterrence really comes into handle. You don't want the other guy to think that, let me try this militarily if I can solve this problem very quickly. I mean, and I think this is honestly where Putin found himself. I think Putin, when people write, where's my historian? Get this down. When people write the history, 2014 will be a real turning point because when he did Crimea, I think he saw a couple of different things. He really saw an incoherent Western response. He really saw a U.S. that was more interested in disengaging from the region. He saw Western Europe that was fragmented, and not just geopolitically, but also culturally fragmented and changing. And I think he thought the West was weak. Much like Osama bin Laden when he decided on 9/11, he thought America was a paper tiger. I think Putin thought that this was a paper tiger, and he actually made it right. Because if he had walked into Ukraine on day 2 and took everything over, then maybe Europe would not have coalesced against the Ukrainians. So that I think is you have to show, if you don't want to risk things like Ukraine, you've got to show the strength of deterrence in the front end. This is language and conceptual thinking that we have really atrophied in the last 10 or 15 years. And maybe for many people, and I'm not saying go back to the Cold War. I always think it's stupid when people say Cold War, because first of all, my dad was in the Korean War. It was cold, but it was cold because he was in the Chosun Reservoir. It was freezing. It wasn't cold because nobody was shooting each other. A lot of people died. A lot of people are dying today. I mean, it's just, I don't think it was a very good metaphor then, but this is a different world, and it's a different kind of competition or adversarial relationship. And we need solutions for this one that work for this time. But it is a language and a depth of seriousness of thinking that I think that we in the international community have really let atrophy over the last decade. And it's really requiring us to do different things. And I think we're probably out of time. But I just want to say this is, I hope that this forum is exactly the kind of place where people will start talking about those ideas that Ed did when he was a leader in the Congress having really serious discussions about these really, really tough issues and putting them out in the public so people can start to make these really, really hard calls. Because that is what we need to do. I think today, we're all hopeful and prayerful for the people of Ukraine. But the reality is we would be looking at this very differently if Putin rolled over. Because it didn't, we have a choice to make a different thing. And I do sense a bit of frustration. Because what we're not getting answers from, and this isn't partisan, it's just the reality, and I think it's just our government, I think so as well, is it's easy to hate, to be angered by the atrocities. It's easy to support the Ukraine people. It's easy to take care of refugees. These are not the really hard decisions. What comes after this? How do we defend ourselves? How do we do with energy? How do we do these really big, tough issues? And I do sense a degree of frustration that people are not getting answers for this. And so we have a lot of angry voices, some on this side, afraid that these yahoos are going to start World War III because they don't know what the heck they're doing. And they believe that America just leaving the world and staying at home and showing maximum restraint is the best thing to do. And a lot of on this side, I think, we just need to have, police stones and start attacking the Russians where it begins. 99% of Americans, I don't think, are either of those places, but 99% of Americans want responsible answers, and they know that these hard questions are coming, and they want answers to the hard questions that work for us. And I think we're one of those things.
Thank you, Dr. Carafano. I think this shows exactly the kind of speaker that we're looking for to kick off this tremendous discussion today. So we're going to roll right into the panel discussion. I would like the panel to come up and join the stage. Congressman Royce is already there and locked and loaded and ready for the discussion. Dr. Valerie O'Regan will be our moderator. Her research area is comparative politics, women politics, and international relations. So we're very delighted to have her as moderator. So Ed Royce is going to be on the panel. Dr. Paul Danieri from UC Riverside. Like I say, the bios are in your programs. Eric Gomez of the Cato Institute is with us. Dr. Heidi Hart from UC Irvine is with us. Dr. Alexei Shevchenko from Cal State Fullerton, and Dr. David Traven from Cal State Fullerton. So we are delighted to have this panel. And I'll turn it over to Dr. O'Regan.
I think we're going to start off with some opening remarks from our panelists, and we will start with Dr. Heidi Hart. If you'd like to start right now, Dr. Hart.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to join you all. I'll briefly introduce myself and then just say a few opening remarks. My name is Dr. Heidi Hart. I am serving a couple hats right now. I've got a couple hats on. I am an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. I'm on sabbatical this year, and I'm actually working for the State Department right now in the NATO office, which is an interesting place to be because I started working for the State Department a week before the war broke out. So I'm working in the State Department as part of a fellowship called the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, and I'll be there until September, which means that, of course, I need to remind you that any views that I express here today are mine alone, so I am speaking with you with my professor hat on. So I'm not expressing the views of the U.S. Government in any capacity. So first, I'd like to just reiterate some of the points that you heard today, and that is that we are truly at a critical juncture right now for U.S. foreign policy. I know that we have a mixed group in the audience today. We have students, we have professors, we have members of the community, and I think it's truly important that we recognize the severity of this invasion. Part of the reason why people are so upset of course, certainly, and perhaps first and foremost, is because of the images that we're seeing today. And I think it's important to start with that human element of what we're seeing. These are atrocities. There are people today who certainly never asked, never wished for their lives to be interrupted, to see the loss of life, the scale of loss of life, particularly against civilians. And so I think we need to stop and just recognize that before we proceed with any of this, that this is truly a set of atrocities that is horrific in all ways. Next, I'd like to just point out that another big reason why we're talking so much about this, why this is covering the front page of all of the newspapers, of all of the social media, whether you get your news from Facebook or Instagram or CNN or New York Times or Fox News, is because of what it means to see a great power invade another sovereign state. When we talk about the rules-based order, and I want to push back a little bit against some of the comments that we heard about the state of play today, we talk about, first and foremost, the recognition of the norm of non-intervention. And what does that mean? In each of these cycles that we've seen, we sort of across the generations, of waves of violence, of waves of conflict, of world wars, states have come together after the fact, right? Diplomats coming around and saying, what can we do to make sure this never happens again? And one of the conversations that continues to come up is perhaps we should try to respect borders, just a little bit, right? And so, if you look back historically, this is why we have, the establishment of the League of Nations. Even before that, Council on Europe. Then, League of Nations didn't work out so well, and then there was the United Nations, and today we have a whole, proliferation of international institutions. And the purpose of those international institutions is ultimately to try to prevent conflict, right? Sometimes we don't think about that. We think of them as just kind of, waste of money or waste of bureaucracy, but ultimately the idea behind them is to create some sort of permanent space so that people can talk to each other. Because if people aren't talking to each other, there's huge problems with misinformation. So I teach courses to PhD students, I teach courses to undergrads, and one of the courses that I teach is about causes of war. And if you look back at the traditional literature on causes of war, some of these key ideas about optimism bias, right? That sometimes leaders are a little bit overly optimistic about how the war is going to go. And misperception, right? Jervis, Blaney, a lot of those key ideas really echo today. And this is part of the reason why people are so nervous, right? Because if people aren't talking to each other, then there can be, misperception can play out in many ways across the battlefield, air, land, sea. Now we're talking about space, we're talking about cyber. So just even the domains in which you could have, leaders misperceiving, or even people down the line, and we're talking about both the civilian and the military side of things, there are a lot, right? There are a lot of opportunities for some miscommunications and misperceptions of what the other side is doing, because sometimes it's really difficult to know what we're thinking. And it's rather amazing to even consider how difficult it is to perceive things, because we live in a world of mass information, right? You think we have the internet, we have a massive capacity, intelligence. But the reality is that sometimes it's really hard to know, even, studying biographies by, Fiona Hill of Putin, it's difficult to know. But we do need to recognize the magnitude of a great power, a nuclear power, invading another state and the implications for that. So before we continue with the panel, I just want to say that I do personally, and again, in my professor hat, I do personally believe that international institutions are important. I do think that the rules-based order is not going to go away anytime soon. I disagree that it's dead, but it is true that this is a critical juncture, and it's going to have to be rethought. Because we do know that international institutions, whether it's NATO, the European Union, the African Union, the Organization of American States, all of these organizations have faced crises. But in fact, the alliance, when we think about NATO itself, it is an international institution. And in fact, beyond, if we think about what we are seeing, we also need to think about what we are not seeing. So we are seeing the invasion of Ukraine and all of its horrific nature, but we are also not seeing invasions into other countries, right, along that eastern flank that we think about, including NATO countries. And research does suggest that being a member state of an alliance matters, that it decreases the likelihood of the countries within that alliance going to war, decreases the likelihood of other types of conflict, incursions. So we need to think about that too. But I do think it means that international institutions will change, but I don't think they're going away anytime soon. They've weathered a lot of storms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. I think we'll start on this side of the tables with Congressman Royce. We can start with your opening remarks, and then we can move down the table.
Thank you. I'll just give a few quick observations here. The first is that this issue with respect to international institutions, no, you're right, Heidi, you're right, they're not going to go away. But it brings up again the necessity, especially given Russian disinformation around the world and in Eastern Europe, the necessity of having a plan to recognize what's actually happening within these institutions in terms of China's influence, which is, I think, the greatest long-term problem. We've got to address that. In terms of your point about strengthening institutions like NATO, I think that Putin has done part of that, and secondarily, I think we did part of that as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. When there was some question about our willingness to back up NATO, I brought up a bipartisan bill and passed it through the House and passed it through saw it passed through the Senate, which made certain that the United States statutorily took the position in Congress that regardless of what position the White House was taking, this would be law. And I think it's back to that question of strategic deterrence. NATO is part of it, but a bigger part of strategic deterrence is showing a state which is slipping into dictatorship that you will take concerted action. And in order to do that, because of Russia's engagement in our elections here, and because of their invasion in 2014, I, as chairman of the committee, authored the bill to put sanctions on Russia. And we passed those with supermajorities. And that act went into effect. And although it had a very adverse impact on Russia, it became increasingly clear that Putin had been dealing with this by moving money out of Russia into the hands primarily of Abramovich, but also, probably the total of 100 oligarchs. But Abramovich is really the individual that handles his portfolio. He's the fellow who transferred title on properties across Russia, got those assets into Gazprom, and then took the proceeds and took that to London and took that all over probably 20 different states where you can hide assets. Part of the answer to this is transparency in our own system here, which we finally have taken in terms of being able to break through shell corporations with the laws now which on beneficial ownership will allow us to see who owns that property. The other point is being very, very clear about how not only the Ukrainians in the West who speak the Ukrainian language and Russian think about this, but to have a clear understanding of how the Ukrainians in the East, in the farthest regions east, feel. And I can tell you, I took a bipartisan coalition of 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats as chairman of the committee. And yes, we went to Kyiv, we talked to them, and the State Department said, don't go east. We took a flight to Dnipropetrovsk, which is as far east as you can get. And then I made arrangements to talk to those from Donetsk. And all I can tell you is at the end of the conversation, one of them whispered to me on the way out, "We've got to figure out a way to get the Russians out of here." And if you look at the council in Luhansk or Donetsk, you'll see that there are no longer Ukrainians on the council. You'll see that now there are Russians from east of the Urals who are calling the shots. And the other observation I would make is that in Dnipropetrovsk itself on the front lines, I saw then, 2014, that they were filling sandbags. There were militia that had spontaneously developed. The mayor of the town was writing checks while we were meeting with him. They were checks for petrol. They were to go into the armored vehicles. They made the pitch, of course, for defense weapons, but they said, "We don't expect you to come here. We need weapons. We know what the Russians intend to do. You need to support us." And that gets us to this final point of strategic deterrence. In 2014, I passed legislation in order to give the executive branch, and this would be under the Obama administration, give the executive branch the authority to give long-range anti-tank weapons, to give high altitude of any kind of stingers, javelins, weapon systems, anti-aircraft systems that would be a credible deterrence. And I can tell you in November, Marie and I were at an embassy, Spanish embassy, and an individual I had not seen for some time approached me from the administration. He'd been in the Obama administration. And he said, "I lost an argument the other day that I lost in the Obama administration, that we lost in the Trump administration, that we've lost in the last 3 administrations, and it was to try to convince an administration. It's November. They're mobilizing. It's time to send those stockpiles now." And he said, during the Obama administration, they had argued with me. This is a Democratic friend of mine, pretty high ranking, that it was too provocative. He says, "That's all I've heard." And the other evening, they said, "It's just too provocative." He said, "This is not the provocative act. The provocative act is not responding." And so I would just say this does have consequences for how Beijing views the response from Taipei, or if they were to attack it. I think now is the time. We understand the bright line. We are not going to put U.S. troops anywhere east of that bright line. But what we must do is that when democratic nations ask us for materiel, ask us for that support, we can't have a little internal debate. "Oh, no, those high-altitude weapons that would take down aircraft above the air cover," which would frankly do the same thing that giving them fighter jets would do. We don't want to transfer that. We don't want that technology to end up in Russian hands. What do you mean? That technology is already in Chinese hands, and the Russians have an equivalent for it. Get it over there now. And what do we mean we don't want to use the long-range anti-tank weaponry that would allow people to more easily take out a Russian tank without risking their own lives? Why don't we give them the best in terms of ultralight vehicles, in terms of drones? Why don't we transfer those drones? You saw what those drones could do to a 40-mile column of tanks by taking out the first few and then knocking out the petrol for the rest of the tanks and the munitions and so forth, and then slowly enveloping. That is a way to demonstrate to the world that democracies can come together, at least to give weapons to other democracies. We should be orchestrating this, and I've overtaken too much time, but thank you.
Well, that's going to be hard to follow. But I'm going to dig into some of the more historical and maybe academic sides of things. My name is Paul Danieri. I'm a professor of political science and public policy over at UC Riverside. And I've spent the last 30 years or so studying the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Lived in Ukraine in the 1990s, have been to both countries multiple times. And in 2019, so just a few years ago, I published a book called Ukraine and Russia, From Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War, really looking at the long-term causes of the war that broke out in 2014. And so that sort of is the background for what I want to talk about. And I'm going to start by digging into some of the history, though I'm not an historian, because I always get a lot of questions about it. So I'm going to try to preempt the questions, though I'll be happy to answer your questions. The historical story for many people in Russia begins in 988 AD. And I want to be clear, not 1988, 988, right? And people sometimes talk about this in the region like it was the week before last. I won't get into what happened in 988. It's basically about when people who are identified as the East Slavic people first were baptized as Christians. But that was in Kiev. And that idea of Kiev as the home of Christendom in that part of the world became very important to a Russian narrative after Moscow rises a couple hundred years later, became central to this Muscovite, then later Russian imperial narrative of why we should control this whole region. It was important to their claims to legitimacy. It was also important to their claims to a broader territory. And that's really persisted right up until 2022. The point that I would make is there's always been two versions of this history. People say, well, hasn't Ukraine always been part of Russia? Well, not exactly. Ukraine has always been contested. And as it was contested on the ground and fought over by militaries, there are these two historical narratives. One is these are unified people. It's roughly the same people. Ukraine's always been part of Russia. And Kiev is the first great city of Russia. There's also a more Ukrainian narrative, I would call it, that's basically a narrative of subjugation and colonization. And that says for this entire 1,200 years, we've been fighting this. And the Russians have won most of the wars, and so they've written most of the history books. And that's maybe why this other narrative is prominent. Of course, I've just scratched the surface here, but the big picture I want to get is that the history is not going to answer any questions for us in the sense of it's going to tell us who owns what. It's become much more of a weapon than an academic discipline. One of the questions I ask myself is, in, say, the mind of Putin or in the Russian leadership, is the history driving a sense of what is ours and what is not ours, or is it the other way around? Is our sense of what it is that we're trying to do geopolitically driving our interpretation of history to get to an interpretation of history that serves our geopolitical goals? And my impression over the last 30 years or so has been that the sort of geopolitics has been driving the history. I never really sensed that anybody cared that much about the history as much as there was just this sense that we want Ukraine. We simply do not accept Ukraine as an independent country. I feel, and I want to stress, this is absolute speculation, my sense is that in recent years, the Russian elite has begun sort of believing its own propaganda in the sense of if for years they were making arguments about history because they served geopolitical goals, they're now actually starting to believe that version of history they've been telling everybody else, and it is beginning to motivate action. That's speculation. But the key point then I want to make about the period after 1991, and I detail this in gory detail in the book, is that from the very moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian elites across the political spectrum were saying, getting rid of communism is great. We don't really need Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan, but Russia, Ukraine, Belarus have to be united, and especially Ukraine, partly because of this historical argument, but partly because of how culturally and economically important Ukraine has been to how Russia saw itself and to the Soviet Union. Second biggest republic in terms of population and in terms of economics as well as the rest of it. That was before NATO expansion was really on the agenda. And again, it was long before Putin came to power. And so I think it's important to emphasize this. And again, except for a very narrow slice of Western-oriented elites, most of whom were out of power by the middle of 1993, that's how the Russian elite felt about this. Pushing forward now to 2014. So in 2014, largely for a mixture of sort of motivations, but also a great opportunity with some chaos in Kiev after this so-called Revolution of Dignity. Russia, as we know, annexes Crimea and starts this proxy war in eastern Ukraine. And what I would stress about that is it was a limited war, right? And it was meant, of course, not necessarily to accomplish everything through the war itself, but to create a situation that was going to lead to the intended result. And that was represented by the so-called Minsk agreements. And the key part of the Minsk agreements, Crimea, I should say, we should separate Crimea from the eastern Ukraine in this respect. Crimea was, we're taking Crimea, it's ours, it's always been ours, we're never going to get it back. This proxy war in eastern Ukraine was intended to force Ukraine to accept the autonomy of these two regions, which are often called pro-Russian regions. And as the congressman rightly pointed out, that's largely a myth. But to the extent that Russia had installed troops there and had installed governments there, they felt that they could control those regions and through them have a veto on Ukraine's foreign policy. And so that seemed to be what was desired. But what actually happened, and I thought you captured this quite well, and Dnipropetrovsk is exactly the place to look for this, is even in eastern Ukraine and even among Russian speakers, Ukrainians said, we want nothing to do with this. So if Russia's goal was to bring our Ukrainian brethren back in, what they actually accomplished was to convince any Ukrainians who doubted it that they want nothing to do with this. They want to be pro-Western, they want to be connected to Western Europe, they want to be democratic, and neither of those things are possible in connection with Russia. So what happens then between 2014, this very limited military approach, to 2022 with this all-out approach? Part of it is that it wasn't working. The Ukrainian government, once the Minsk agreement had been signed, the Ukrainian government took a fairly hard line in the negotiations to say, we're not going to do this in a way that allows you to have a veto over our foreign policy. The attitude shifts were clear, and in particular in 2019, this guy called Volodymyr Zelensky got elected president, and I think the Russians thought he would be a pushover. He was young, political novice, and he's a comedian. Right? What could be better? Zelensky actually tried to cut a deal, and Putin gave him nothing in return. And Zelensky at that point kind of said, okay, I'm going to do what turns out he's pretty good at, which is speaking to the people and speaking to the West. So what's changed in the big picture then is, for the West, really I think up until 6 weeks ago, many people were asking themselves, the question we were asking is, how do we make a deal with Russia? How do we accommodate Russia? And I think the Russians have finally managed to prove that that's not going to work, that they're not going to be accommodated. And so the logic of Western strategy now has changed, or I think has changed, I hope has changed, from reasoning with Russia, accommodating Russia, to defeating Russia. The future of Europe, and to a large extent the future of democracy worldwide, now depends on the battlefield defeat of Russia. And I agree with the points that have been made, which is that we may have arguments over exactly what red lines we want to cross or don't cross, but if Russia wins this war, it's going to be bad. I'll just leave it at that. I'll finish up with what maybe a little bit about a view from the ground. So I have a couple of Ukrainians, friends of mine from years ago, who are now living with me in Riverside. They left Ukraine right as the war started. They spent 65 hours trying to get out of Ukraine and back up at the border of Poland, and last week they were able to fly to LAX. And I was talking with one of these folks this morning before I came over here, and she just talked to one of her friends who's still on the ground in Ukraine. And she said, people are starting to go back to Kiev because the Russians are withdrawing from Kiev. And she said, my friend said to me, we've pushed them back once. That's not going to do it. They'll be back. They're going to regroup and they'll be back. And then we're going to have to push them back again. And then they're going to regroup and they will be back. We're going to have to defeat them 3 times. Right? After we've defeated them the 3rd time, then you can come back to Kiev. And I say that maybe to add a little dramatic flair and some first-person sense of things, but I think that that's really what this turns to now. And I'm not an expert on military affairs, but this is now very much a military matter. How this turns out at the bargaining table is going to be driven very much by what happens on the battlefield. And to me, that's a sad state of affairs. Thank you.
Okay, I'm David Traven. I'm a political science professor here at CSU Fullerton, and my main area of research and teaching is international law, particularly laws of armed conflict, sometimes called the laws of war, and U.S. foreign policy. Since I'm not a regional specialist, so I can't get into the history and the dynamics of the current conflict in the way that some of my colleagues up here can do. But as I mentioned, my area of focus is the laws of armed conflict, and over the last few days, that has been sort of the center of attention internationally. What's been going on in Ukraine and some of the images that are coming out of some of the surrounding areas in Kiev, particularly in Bucha, of the mass killings. And in the early days of the war, there was apprehension about whether or not there had been direct attacks on civilians. In particular, the focus at the beginning seemed to have been on decapitation strategy, regime change, and it seemed like what the Putin regime wanted to do more directly was have it, focus on getting rid of the regime, and then quickly after that, they sort of once they realized that regime change wasn't going to work, they sort of shifted their tactics towards essentially obliterating entire cities in terms of taking out civilian hospitals, the maternity ward, attacking the theater that had clearly, now I don't read Russian, but apparently in the front and the back of the theater it said children in large letters. And that's, very clearly a war crime. When you see something like that in armed conflict, there's oftentimes some level of deniability. So the opposing side will say, well, this is just collateral damage. It's we were attacking military targets, and it just so happened that civilians were harmed as a result of that. The images that are coming out of Bucha right now show that there is absolutely no doubt that there are mass war crimes going on, and I would even say crimes against humanity, which crimes against humanity is basically a level up of just individual war crimes. So a war crime is, violating the laws of war, targeting civilians or civilian populations, engaging in torture against POWs and so forth. A crime against humanity is a systematic attack upon the civilian population. So if there's individual attacks on civilians, you can always say, well, maybe it was some soldier that went berserk, right? If you see it over and over and over again, the more civilian buildings that are blown up, residential areas that are basically decimated, there is no doubt about what has happened, and in fact, it indicates that someone in the upper echelons of the military or the state made some decision to go forth with this particular strategy. So at this point, I think that it's not, there's no doubt at all about what is taking place, and it's nice to see the international community calling a fact rather than raising questions about what is actually going on. But I think the deeper question has to do with what we are going to do in response to that. So, as I said, I teach classes in international law, and every time there is some sort of mass humanitarian disaster or genocide or ethnic cleansing campaign, people say, well, never again. We'll just make sure that the next time this doesn't happen. And then it happens again, and then they say, well, okay, the next time we will actually do something to bring this to an end. Now, it's a political question as to what exactly you do in response to this, but I think very, very clearly, at the very least, I think that I would like to see the administration publicly commit to saying our goal is to ensure that Russia is defeated. I hear people saying, well, we need to give Vladimir Putin an off-ramp because he might be crazy and he might detonate a nuclear weapon. That's certainly something that needs to be taken into very serious consideration. On the other hand, you could just say, well, an off-ramp is you just leave the country, right? Bring an end to it, and that is your off-ramp, right? And it seems like if you give an off-ramp to where he can go back to his people and say, see, look, I achieved some victory. My concern is that there's no accountability and that he will do it again. And so I think what we need to do is publicly commit to saying he needs to be the regime, not necessarily the regime. Of course, like I said, that's, Biden got in enough trouble by saying, making the comment at the end of his speech, saying, for God's sake, this guy can't be in power any longer. But at the very least, militarily, they need to be defeated. That just has to happen because there will be no accountability at all for anyone who has made a decision amounting to a war crime if they just are able to get away. So that's what I think needs to happen. So.
Thanks. My name is Alexei Shevchenko, and I'm teaching American foreign policy and also Chinese and Russian foreign policy. So I'm a mix of generalist and kind of area specialist here at Cal State Fullerton, Department of Political Science. But let me start with the big picture, and then we can talk about the details of situation in Ukraine and elsewhere. Sort of the conclusions after 40 years of, 40 days of war, right? 40 plus days of war. One conclusion for me is that, well, there was this hope since the end of the Cold War that liberal order or rules-based order can integrate rising powers or resurgent powers which are not part of the West. They can be transformed as part of a kind of a participation in this liberal order because they will find incentives to get their act together essentially and to subscribe to Western norms and rules. I think this hope is dashed with Russia, obviously. Did not happen. We still have some semblance of this hope with China, which I think is a little bit of a different story than Russia, but definitely a lot of questions whether this is achievable at all. So that's sort of the first conclusion I would draw. The second one, obviously, we see a collapse of post-Cold War settlement and concurrent crisis of security structure in Europe. And yes, NATO is still holding, but the crisis is much deeper than we anticipated only a couple of months ago, and that calls for rethinking of a lot of basics in terms of European security. We see Russia evolving into, in the language of international relations theory, revisionist state, which is a risk taker, which is a very dangerous combination. We also see a push from Russia, and this is backed up by China as well, to rethink the structure of international politics and to switch from this kind of a rule-based liberal order into something akin to the 19th century. I mean, it really reminds me 19th century more than anything else, something based on spheres of influence, great powers carving the world into spheres of influence and essentially dominating there. So those are sort of my big conclusions based on what we are observing in addition to this particular tragedy in Ukraine. Obviously, we are observing proxy war between NATO, the United States, and Russia. The good news is that Putin's strategy misfired. The strategy, as David mentioned, was to try to decapitate the government in Ukraine, to take over Kiev. It was extremely ambitious, and it looked like it failed. It looked like Putin forgot one of the lessons from von Clausewitz. The maximum use of force is in no way incompatible with the simultaneous use of the intellect. I think it just didn't click this time. So there is some lessons for optimism. And there have been some questions how China would assess the situation. I think China is watching the situation unfolding very, very carefully. And it might be rethinking its strategy towards Taiwan, at least temporarily, looking at what happened with sanctions, looking at what happened with Russian military strategy, looking at this outrage at the behavior of Russian military in Ukraine. So there's some positive things as well, which we can add into the mixture, but you definitely have this conflict between two visions of global politics. 19th century or what was created since the end of the Cold War.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Eric Gomez. You can read my bio in the thing. I look at nuclear weapons and East Asia, so I'm not going to talk about Ukraine at all, and instead focus, well, I'll maybe throw in a little bit at the end there. But I have slides. So, what's interesting about the US-China nuclear relationship in particular is that so far in great power competition with China, we've had the good fortune of keeping nuclear weapons mostly in the background. There's this sort of general understanding that China is a nuclear power, but it hasn't really been a prime focus of the competition until recently. And part of the reason is this. This is a breakdown of the nuclear arsenals of United States, Russia, and China with some caveats. This is mostly a counting of strategic deployed nuclear forces. It doesn't count Russia's large stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons. And this is all from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which produced these regular updates of nuclear forces. And what you can see here is the US and Russia have a huge lead on China, at least in terms of raw numbers. And what's interesting is that for most of its history, China has never really thought about nuclear weapons the same way that we or the Russians have. The Chinese have primarily focused on very small forces, forces that are geared primarily towards assured retaliation, and no first use, and they've implemented operational procedures at the unit levels to make those credible, right? So they don't have this tradition of nuclear warfighting, they don't have a tradition of preemptive nuclear attack that motivated a lot of US and Soviet thinking, and now I would argue US and Russian thinking. So we've kind of had this relatively good picture until last summer, the United States satellite imagery analysts revealed imagery of 3 silo fields under construction in China's interior that could all hold ICBMs. There's about 120 silos in this field. There's 2 others, each with 120 apiece, so 360 potential. Now, these are still under construction. They are not finished yet, and we do not know how many missiles will go in them or how many warheads those missiles will carry. But I think this shows an important factor that this nuclear aspect of the relationship could be changing, right? And that nuclear weapons, and not just in the US-China context, but also in the US-Russia context, could become much more prominent over time. And I think what's interesting about what makes this and other recent Chinese nuclear modernization very interesting, and I think this is more a question of, this is where we will silo off China versus Russia. I think you can make credible arguments both ways for this, right? Because I think the real worry is, does a larger Chinese nuclear arsenal signal a fundamental change in nuclear strategy that is more aggressive than what they've known for since 1964 when they first tested nuclear weapons and developed their strategy? Because on the one hand, if you're worried about having a very adversarial relationship with the United States is really good at conventional counterforce targeting, right? This is the destruction of nuclear forces without crossing the nuclear threshold via a mix of conventional precision strike and missile defense systems. I think the Chinese give us far too much credit for what those capabilities can actually do. But I do think that in their own writings and in the way that they talk about this, this has been a persistent concern for at least a decade. And number 2, the US is very good at low-yield nuclear weapons. And we've expanded those arsenals under the after the Trump administration with the W-76 Mark II. I think the Biden administration is going to move away from the low-yield SLCM, which I think is a good idea. But suffice it to say, right, like this type of behavior could be entirely consistent with, oh no, the threats to the arsenal are growing, therefore we will grow the arsenal to meet the threat, right? And we will fundamentally have a very limited nuclear strategy, and this is a means of preventing the United States from threatening that force. Or you could view it much more negatively, and to say that China is now developing the technical capacity to adopt a much more aggressive nuclear strategy, or potentially a more aggressive conventional military strategy. This idea of if you can checkmate the United States or you can have strategic or nuclear deterrence at a relatively stable level, that might open the door to more aggressive activity below the nuclear threshold. So I don't know, right? Because I look at some sources of evidence, especially authoritative Chinese documents about how they think about nuclear strategy, and I haven't detected any changes yet, at least nothing so fundamental as to say we have a radically different view of nuclear strategy that is going to be much more aggressive. But at the same time, if you have a bunch of additional nuclear weapons in fields, that can help, right? So you have this sort of technical threshold has been crossed where if you wanted to do that, you could. Whereas 5 or 10 years ago, you couldn't even if you wanted to. So I think going forward, and I think this is mostly China specific, but I think it also has some interesting implications for Russia, I think there's sort of 3 big things that I think about after this. Number one, when it comes to Taiwan especially, we need to be very honest in public policy debates that this will be a nuclear conflict from the get-go. Not necessarily in the sense of nuclear weapons being used right away, but in the sense that if the US shows up, the likelihood of nuclear war with the Chinese is high. And where you wind up on the do you intervene, do you not intervene question, I don't particularly care. But I think that in most discussions about US-China defense competition and a Taiwan conflict scenario, this aspect gets tossed out. Right? I have academic mentors from my days at the Bush School at Texas A&M who had participated in war games with DoD about the US-China fighting over Taiwan. And they like to say, yeah, whenever someone brought up nuclear weapons, everyone was like, well, time to break for lunch, right? Because, or someone pointed out like, oh, what if the Chinese use a nuclear weapon? And then they were told, well, you can't do that. That's not part of this game, right? Like, no, like you could do that. And I think that this is something where that needs to be part of the active conversation and debate, regardless of where you end up. The second point, and this sort of relates to the Taiwan piece, but is broader, and relates to the Russia piece, is how does the US provide this extended deterrence, and how do we provide for conventional military strategy with stuff like this, right? Because we essentially have drawn our security perimeter in the backyards of these countries, and that's fine, but they're going to be fighting over interests that are very proximate to them, that they probably innately care more about than we do, and they have nuclear weapons, right? That is a very challenging deterrence picture, both at the conventional level and at the strategic level. And when you're talking about conventional military strategy, are there ways to implement a defense strategy that are sensitive to what's known as inadvertent escalation risk? This is a concept in nuclear theory where if you're fighting a conventional war for conventional reasons, do you accidentally hit something that is relevant to the other side's nuclear secure second strike? Because if you do, you could push them down a path that's pretty dangerous. And I'm from the Cato Institute, card-carrying member of Team Restraint. This is something that the restraint defense people think about a lot in terms of how do you structure US conventional military strategy. We like to do it in ways that reduce the inadvertent escalation risk, but there's also a case to be made for doing it in ways that actually could increase it on purpose, to use risk and to use that intentional danger as a way to enhance deterrence. And that goes back to what Dr. Carafano was saying earlier about doing this extended deterrence thing and doing this conventional deterrence thing. And I think that's, I'm sure he and I would disagree on that. I'm not sure he's still here. But I think that's a interesting and an important debate that's happening right now. And finally, I think this is the sort of appeal to diplomacy. Engaging China on some measure of arms control, I think, is going to become both more essential and more difficult over time. More difficult in the sense that I think the US-China relationship is heading down into a spiral and will not pull out, which makes it harder to build up a level of mutual trust and confidence in one another that you can actually get to arms control. Then again, we were able to get it with the Soviets in the 70s, so who knows, it might still be possible somewhat. But that will make it harder to get. At the same time, it becomes more important because this freaks the DoD out, right? The Department of Defense is thinking a lot about China nukes, China nukes, China nukes. When the STRATCOM commander testified to Congress last month, the first thing he talked about was China, which I found was interesting because usually it's Russia. But this is a really big driver of DoD thinking and threat perception. And so that's why you sort of need arms control. I think the Trump administration, when it tried to get China in on trilateral arms control with the Russians, the heart was in the good place, but they're not going to do that because that, right? The Chinese are not going to agree to limit the size of their arsenal when the arsenal is already so much smaller. So maybe, silver lining, if all these come to pass, maybe that bar gets different and they say, okay, we're ready to do limits now once we build up to your level, rather than us building down to theirs. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer on what effective arms control looks like with the Chinese, but I think we're going to have to think about it in creative ways beyond just mutual limitations on numbers, because we just aren't at that equal level. And with that, I will end and return to that lovely picture. Thank you so much.
All right, I think we'll start with a general question for the panelists right now. The question is, did the U.S. post-Cold War strategy contribute to the return of great power rivalry? And how did it do that?
I'll take a stab.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that it did a few things. Number one, I think post-Cold War, we got a little high on our own supply in terms of the unipolar moment, right? And we're the biggest, we're the strongest, we did it, we won, right? We won the Cold War. And I think what's interesting is, like, in countries like Iran and North Korea, we've solved almost nothing, right? We're still kind of in the same place we were a decade ago, or even worse positions than we were. And I think part of that has to do with, who's on the other side, but a part of it also has to do with the US has stuck to very maximalist goals in those places for a long time that we probably can't realistically achieve anymore. And I think that, so now we're entering a period of renewed great power competition, but we still haven't successfully dealt with the minor power competition either. So in many ways, it's like even worse. And I think that another thing about, the US post-Cold War strategy is we spent a lot of time throwing a lot of resources into things like the Iraq War, into things like Afghanistan. And I think that has done a few things. Number one, I think that has drained the US military substantially in terms of wearing it down. And number two, I think it's drawn political attention away from places like China and Russia, right? So just the focus is not there, and so that kind of let things get out of hand. And finally, I think the important thing is the non-military tools of US foreign policy have gotten very, very weak. The response to Russia, I think, is actually a good sign that so much of this has been directed through things like sanctions and political leadership and economic leadership. And yes, there is a defense component. Yes, there is a security component. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have any security component. But I think too often we underappreciate the value of those other aspects of foreign policy. I'm not sure if that's the fault of the unipolar era, but when you can kind of swing your weight around the world militarily without much consequence, I think it kind of builds bad behavior or builds bad habits about how you see and think through problems that we just cannot do anymore. So I think rebuilding that stuff is going to be important. And to the credit of the Biden administration, I think they recognize that.
I'll just add an observation on how I think we may have mishandled an issue at the end of the Cold War, and it has to do with allowing Russia to move forward on its own with perhaps not enough engagement. The reason I know a little bit about this is the individual who deregulated in the United States telecommunications had suggested to a number of U.S. economists at that time that what we wanted to do during their privatization program is pick the best experts in deregulating telecommunications and deregulating all of these other sectors where you had these parastatal institutions, get them on the ground, that professional advice, and get them to weigh in. And as I understand it, and I wasn't in the debate, but as I understand it, although Milton Friedman had a lot of great ideas in terms of market economy, you can't be an absolutist about these things and think that economic man is the answer to everything. His presumption was, no, we stay out of it. We let the Russians privatize along their own lines. We don't go in there and try to micromanage with expertise in each of these sectors. And I know that consequently, what happened was that these assets were sold off, frankly, first to Yeltsin's allies, and soon after that, in a very major way, to Putin's allies. And those with experience in the KGB or alliances there, those were the apparatchiks who got the assets. Now, if your long-term goal was to move the society from an authoritarian one to one in which everyone had a voice, you've just allowed a cadre, or in this particular case, a political movement largely stemming out of the training they had in the KGB, who believed in collectivism, not individualism, who were taught that the reason Sparta won against Athens, against a democratic state, is because they were tough enough to throw the carcasses, of animals into the cisterns, into the water wells, and kill a third of the people. These were people who were trained on the opposite side of the divide of a liberal, arts education, in which we would have learned individualism. I learned this from a Ukrainian who had been interrogated by a KGB officer, got to know him, and asked him a lot of questions. He was very well educated. He was very well educated, but in all the wrong things. And he just took the opposite side. And he said, imagine living under a society in which those who got to the top and got all the wealth because of their closeness to Putin had these views, because the first thing they wanted to do, cut off freedom of speech, control freedom of thought, control information. Nobody could start a business without being connected. Everything was based on political pull. Nothing was based on a real market economy in terms of those who were going to get to the top. I think if we ever get the chance again in Moscow, we have to be ready with a kind of time and patience and planning that the United States put in after World War II, where we work with local communities. And despite what you might read in your history books, it didn't go that way. It took years of taking out those Wolverine units. It took years of working with those who wanted to be democratic voices, and you can change that culture. But I'll close with this. I wasn't there to hear it, but I'm told that one of Milton Friedman's last regrets before he passed away, he said, "It's Russia. I got Russia wrong." It was never about economics. It was about culture. Teaching a culture based on the rule of law, based on individual rights, it turns out that that's enormously important to stability of the world. Because otherwise, when people take all of the power, as we know, and they keep taking power they eventually start thinking like a Bonaparte. They want to be the ruler of Europe, or what have you. And Putin right now, he gave a speech the other day about Kazakhstan. They're on rented land. That's leased land. That's Russian land. So this isn't just about Ukraine. This is about a view that he is selling, just as Goebbels communicated a view into a generation of young Germans as soon as the Reich got power. He is selling an ideal to them. And one of the things he has said, our sphere of influence should include Poland, Hungary, and he goes right down the list of everything east of Germany. This is a real problem. We've got to figure out how to get these ideas into the pipeline, into Russia, but more than that, next time we've got to get the expertise in there, the engagement, so that a Yeltsin doesn't end up appointing a Putin, which is what he did. We've got to be engaged in this world with our allies. Thank you.
I would just add that I think there are a lot of things that we can validly critique about U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, both in general, but also as it relates to Russia. And I think, however, especially as it relates to Russia, to say that the United States made some really big mistakes is not to say that the United States controlled all the outcomes. And I do fear that we're in a little bit of danger if the mistake we made 30 years ago was assuming we had more control over Russia than we did, or more influence in Russia than we did. I sometimes fear that now, looking back and throwing blame on ourselves, we project backwards more influence than we really did. I think it's important to preserve a role for Russian agency in what happened in Russia in the 1990s. They were not a blank slate that we were drawing on. There were actors in Russia with strong interests, strong ideas about what should happen, which explains why even when we did do the right things, and we did a lot of right things along with the wrong things, even when we did the right things, they tended to turn out badly. And that's because there were people working pretty hard for those results. Especially as it relates to Ukraine, I'll just say it again, that's not something that happened later. In fact, if you go back and look at why did they throw a coup against Gorbachev in 1991, it was largely to do with them not liking a treaty he was going to sign that was going to give more autonomy to Ukraine and some of the other republics. So a lot of this stuff was baked in from the beginning. It's not something that we did, though we certainly did a lot of stuff.
I think another thing that I'll add here is that it's important to remember that this is also a resources question. So I certainly agree that when we think back on historically the decisions that U.S. leaders made, those were in response to the context at the time, and so we need to be aware that people can only make information with make decisions with the information that they have at hand, and certainly. We have limited control over, over the decisions of leaders in other countries. That said, I think it is an opportunity to think about, what some of the lessons are. And in that post-Cold War period, in addition to some of the other factors that my panelists have brought up, it's also, critical to think about where the money has gone. And there's been a gutting of, resources investing in diplomacy, gutting of resources invested in USAID, and some of those institutions that have been really critical for our understanding of what we might consider our quote-unquote rivals. And so when we think about the decisions that are being made, it's also important to make sure that you understand the thinking that's going on, right? Having deep expertise. Which brings me to another point, which is something that I think we have really limited control over, which is retirement. And a lot of the people today, who really have some of that expertise in places like the State Department, in places like DoD, or in my own research, I wrote a book on NATO and strategic learning in NATO. It's called NATO's Lessons in Crisis. But in that book, they talked about the same thing. A lot of the interview subjects, that those old timers, so to speak, who have that really deep knowledge that we need, are generationally retiring. right? Well deserved, okay? Well deserved. But that means that, as part of, budget cuts that have happened, you have people rotating through in shorter and shorter time intervals, and it makes it hard to hold on to some of that knowledge about what works in terms of messaging, what works in terms of signaling, what doesn't, what is a waste of time. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind as we're thinking through, decisions moving forward. How can we leverage some of the knowledge that already exists about how the U.S., say, for example, communicates with a country like Russia that has culturally, as you just talked about, very different viewpoints, even about the concept of sovereignty, individualism, collectivism, et cetera.
Yeah, I guess I'll be brief. On post-Cold War strategy and what did that do to contribute to the return of great power rivalry? I mean, there's a number of factors, but I think one thing that, I was young during the end of the Cold War, so I don't remember it as vividly as some of the folks in this room probably do. But what I do recall about it and about some of the historical literature about the end of the Cold War was there was this moment of kind of euphoria, and this was the end of history, and democracy was going to, wave across the world. And I think that hope is obviously something that we should want, but I think that there comes a tendency to think that this is the end of history. This is how things are going to end up working out. And I mean, over the last month, history has reared its ugly head in Ukraine, and so I think there was probably a tendency to think that you weren't going to have to actually put anything on the line to uphold your values like democracy and human rights. Those are things that if you really believe in them, you have to actually act in accordance with them when there is a threat to them. And so I think the tendency to think that democracy was just going to take root, and then if you could just engage China, they are going to be democratic. I mean, that is a policy that goes way back into the Cold War, back to the Nixon administration. And he had his own objectives for pursuing that strategy, but it's taken quite a long time for people to realize that actually is not going to work. That if you want to actually defend democracy, you have to actually defend democracy when it's threatened. And in the case of Russia, I mean, it just seems like every single presidential administration going back to the end of the Cold War came into office wanting to restart things, improve the relationship. And it has taken this long to realize that that's just not the way that it's going to go. And so I think one of the things that we should do going forth is just not take anything for granted. Don't take for granted that the world is going to work itself out, and that we're not going to have to lift a finger or put anything at stake to uphold values of democracy and human rights. I think that that's something we should think about going forward.
Right. Yeah, I think there was lack of understanding of the importance of status concerns, prestige concerns for rising or aspiring rising powers. I think Russia is a good example of that. And if you create a perception of exclusion from high status great power clubs in international politics, if you create perceptions of being humiliated, kind of denied membership or cheated, that sort of Russian complaint about the expansion of NATO. I don't think expansion of NATO was just a security issue for Russia. I think it was an issue of being treated with respect and kind of a great power status. I think if that happens, if you don't have status accommodation of aspiring great powers, history shows that it frequently leads to kind of anger, vengefulness, and conflict. And I think that's something which authoritarian regimes are especially adept in tapping and kind of mobilizing. And I think that's what we are looking, well, that's one of the drivers of Russian behavior today. Thank you.
It seems that we really do want to talk about Russia here. So I'll do a Russian question then. What impact will the war and U.S. relations with Russia have on domestic policy, or excuse me, politics in the United States?
If we're lucky, it will have the impact that Roosevelt's decision, first to supply Britain and our other allies, and then to vanquish, you know, the Reich and the Axis powers. The result of that were the institutions like NATO that came out of that. The result of that was also a bipartisanship, and I think this is the most important aspect of it. Senator Vandenberg and the Republicans in the Senate made the decision that we had to learn from the fact that isolationism as a strategy was a cul-de-sac in terms of being able to handle authoritarian states that were bent on conquest. And so their focus was building bipartisan institutions after the war that would be primarily focused on threats to market economy, democratic societies, rule of law, and they did as best a job at the time as they knew how to do. And I think what it did, two things had an impact on this. One was the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which started the war, in which, you know, Stalin sought to take Finland and the Baltic states and Romania, parts of Romania, a lot of Eastern Poland, and Hitler would take the West, created for the left a crisis in their reevaluation on Marxism as an ideology, but specifically communism as a movement. And on the isolationist right, it created a reappraisal of the fact that what we had in common with support for democratic institutions in Europe was much more important than our differences. Hence the architecture post-war, hence bringing at least Americans together for as long as the institutional memory continued about what the world looked like without U.S. leadership and without us focused on the big picture. And so my thought is this might lead to a period of public policy debates and discussions where it's not listening to talking heads on cable news, but we get back to following the facts about what's happening around the world rather than subsuming ourselves in our own ideology. And we understand a lot more about the way in which people are radicalized by information, such as information that the Russians put out, and begin the hard process of getting back to what the United States stands for based upon our charter, based upon our declaration, and also understanding a certain reality, and that is when there are other states in the world that share that view and are allied with us, it gives us a better opportunity to defend these institutions, as we did in the Second World War with our allies. We would have been in a tough position had we waited or been allowed to wait. We weren't because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But these lessons, I think, are important. They're important in steeling the resolve of Americans to act as Americans and get back to the serious business of engaging and leading in the rest of the world and doing a lot of it through information because that's a non-confrontational way to spread our views and information based upon our principles. Thanks.
The last thing I'm going to do is make predictions about the future of U.S. politics. But I will make 2 points that I think are relevant. One is that within the U.S. Congress, where often it seems like they can't agree on whether it's day or night or east or west, there's an enormous consensus on Russia and Ukraine. And that's been true for several years now. And so I think that's worth noting. The idea that the U.S. elite, or the U.S. Congress in particular, divides on everything, the big exception on that actually is Russia and Ukraine. The other thing I'll point out, and I don't know where it leads, but I think it's worth noting, is that one of the most prominent voices in television talking, I don't know what else to call it, is basically asserting Putin's line on this conflict. And I don't know where that leads, but I think it's relevant in some way.
I think another thing to be aware of is just to follow what's going to happen in terms of public opinion support for a number of different things that are going on right now. So I have a point on the point that you just made, because I think it's critical to think about the role of Congress as well. But I've, in my own research, because I'm more of a NATO scholar, that's my area of expertise, have been following public opinion for NATO. And so one thing that was interesting is that generally for decades and decades, since NATO first came on the scene, NATO has had strong bipartisan support. But what happened under the Trump administration, some of you may have remembered, there were some comments that were a little bit cringeworthy towards NATO as an institution. And so perhaps in response or not, it's hard to know the directionality of things. But during the Trump administration, we did see a drop, particularly among Republicans, in support of NATO. Not a huge drop, but a little bit of a drop. And I'm sure, I haven't looked at the numbers yet because we're still waiting for some more polls to come out. I mean, we're 40 days on, I think, at this point, around 40 days since the beginning of the war. But I imagine that gap will probably close as I think there's probably going to be stronger support on both sides of the aisle. I think also and again, I agree with you. I mean, especially in an academic role, I don't want to predict too much. But I'd be curious to see what will happen in terms of the Democrats, in particular, their support for, and not all of them, but some of their support for trying to limit some of the spending that we've seen for defense spending. Those arguments will presumably be more difficult to make in light of a clear crisis, a clear threat that is getting the bipartisan support for, and a lot of it's very clear, to go back to the point that we were hearing, is that these images of war crimes are something that is very difficult to argue against. How do you rationalize something like that? And irrespective of your partisanship or your background, bombing a maternity ward is inexcusable. So things like that, I think, are something to watch in terms of the DoD spending, and also similarly support for further spending on State Department, on USAID. So how is this moment going to shift the resource allocation? Because resources drive the ability for the U.S. and countries in general to be able to follow through with priorities. It's one thing to set political goals, and it's then another thing to be able to have the capacity to follow through with those. So those are some things that I would watch. I would just say I'm going to have to pop out since I have another 4 p.m. appointment. But again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share my thoughts and hear from this distinguished panel.
All right, thanks.
So I guess, I too can't look into my crystal ball and see what impact this is going to have on domestic politics. I think my fear is that this will end up being something that is just going to be part of the increasing polarization in U.S. politics. I mean, it's good to see that people on both sides of the aisle have kind of unified around a consensus on this. But the worry that I have is that that the longer that this plays on, that it will just feed into political polarization in a way that people won't be really seeing the conflict for what it is, but they'll be seeing it through the lens of partisan or ideological politics. So that's a fear that I have. I mean, my hope is that that it encourages a degree of understanding on what matters. For all the devastation, one of the things that war sometimes does is it sort of focuses the mind on what's important. And so, when you see, like Dr. Hart said, you see those images, you can't deny that. And, especially when you see the people with their hands tied behind their backs, executed in the streets, I mean, there's no way that you can rationalize your way around that. There's no way that you can say, well, this must have been just an accident. I mean, they tried to play it off as if it was a false flag or if it was made up. But it seems that, for now at least, that the consensus is that this isn't made up, and that people seem to be coming together. So my hope would be that not necessarily on everything. I mean, part of democracy is competition and focused, civilized, so to speak, conflict through our political institutions. But at the same time, I think that people need to realize that there's something more important than partisan politics and ideology. So.
All right, moral clarity is a great thing. Bipartisanship is rare, and it's also a welcome development. My only fear is that if this sort of moral clarity, this bipartisanship, this rally around the flag effect can contribute to problems with diplomatic settlement of this crisis. Because if you have to ask the question how it will end, it has to be a diplomatic settlement. How do you deal with a murderous dictator? Isn't everything appeasement, right? Wouldn't public opinion just torpedo any diplomatic solution, which is a compromise by definition? It's a give and take, right? So that's sort of my big fear looking forward and asking the question how it will all end. And we need a ceasefire urgently. And we need the beginnings of political settlement. Please.
I don't know. I don't know if I have anything of value to add at this point. I think my panelists covered the landscape pretty well, and I like China more. So there's one thing I hate more than U.S. foreign policy. It's U.S. domestic politics.
All right, we're going to take a short break right now, and when we come back, we'll open it up to audience questions. All right, so about 5-10 minutes, and we'll come back in to this room, and the panelists will answer your questions.
Russia will be beaten in Ukraine either on the battlefield or through a negotiated settlement. What impact on either of those two outcomes does the fact that Putin is being labeled as a war criminal have on the chances of either one of those being resolved quickly?
You wanted to go with that one, or you want me to? Well, I don't think Putin much cares about global opinion at this point. I think there is a common argument that especially if somebody's facing indictment or actually being hauled off to The Hague, that it makes it harder to reach a settlement. But I think we were just actually talking about this at the break. I think that the likelihood that he's going to get hauled anywhere is so slim that it's not going to play a meaningful part in the negotiations. It probably doesn't help for him to have been indicted if that's something that happens. But I don't think it's going to have a big impact on it. What's going to have a big impact on it is him getting what he wants, and we don't exactly know precisely what that is, and finding some way to make that match with what the Ukrainians are willing to accept. And that, as I said earlier, I think that will be based very much by developments on the battlefield.
So, I think one thing that it may make more difficult is, oh, all right, right into the microphone. Okay. All right. It strikes me that it's, now I don't claim to know what's going on in Putin's mind. I mean, even one of the striking things about what's been taking place over the last month is that how many experts have said we're completely shocked as to why he went ahead and did this. And if the experts are saying that, I'm not a Putin expert, so I am absolutely completely shocked. So whether or not he will actually, that will deter him from wanting to do anything or wanting to come to some sort of negotiated settlement, I don't know. If I had to bet, I'd say probably not, because I'd have to imagine that, I mean, you have to know what a likely consequence is going to be if there are mass killings. I mean, people are going to be absolutely horrified. So if he were to say, well, I'm completely shocked that the world was so angry about that, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I think the thing that it may make more difficult is for leaders of democratic states to sit down on the other side of the table. Because it's like if you've just said, well, the guy's a war criminal, murderous dictator, whatever, I mean, it's like, do you want to have a photo opportunity with him? I mean, it strikes me as no. So I think there's a degree to which it may have that kind of effect.
It's not just a deal between Russia and Ukraine. The United States will have to be involved in one form or another. And I think I agree with David that this complicates American role. The more you invest in this sort of conflict of values and criticism of Putin as a murderous dictator, the harder it is to reach a compromise. I think that's the trade-off.
I have nothing instructive to add.
What's most difficult to understand is if you're negotiating with him. So far, the negotiations on issues such as humanitarian corridors, we woke up this morning and for the umpteenth time, 20 days or so, the attempt to get the buses in to take out the last, some of the women and children that want to flee was stopped by the Russians at the border. He knows that he's lying in these negotiations. And the difficulty of the negotiations, of course, is that Zelensky knows the same thing. By now he knows that Putin is lying. And the other concern, I don't think it impacts it because I don't think Putin cares what happens in The Hague. I think, however, what happens if Ukraine is forced to capitulate is that it feeds the enthusiasm for Putin, who's already spoken to this issue on Kazakhstan, as I mentioned, and on other fronts, to consider what used to be considered the unthinkable, that he would attack. There are other nations in Europe, as you know, that are not part of NATO. Finland is one of them. For some crazy reason, Putin, as Stalin before him, used to claim that Finland was once part of the greater empire. I know how the Finns are concerned. There's a reason they're not in NATO. They wish they were at the moment. We don't want all the former the Central Asian republics that were once part of Russia to face attacks or ultimatums by Putin because we haven't done enough to give the Ukrainians the weaponry to defend themselves. They need to get advanced weapons over that border from Poland quickly, as the Poles have been telling us, and as everybody who's been on the ground sees. That's the best way to convince Putin to actually make an agreement that withdraws troops, because the losses are too great. That's the way to resolve it.
All right, thank you. Another question?
Yes, my name is Reza Karkia from World Affairs Council trustee. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful panel and very informative information came across. My question is that in the equation of US, Russia, China, where do we consider Iran as a proxy of Russia, especially with this recent experience that Russian ambassador was negotiating on behalf of Iran with United States, and also Iran becoming a regional power, so-called. Where do we stand and how we are going to be handling the situation there? Thank you.
Go ahead. No, please, Representative, go ahead.
I want to yield to the gentleman from Cato.
All right. So I kind of hinted at this in my comments before about the Cold War and how the U.S. has kind of failed to take any of the small problems off the board while we now have the big problems. I think the Iran nuclear deal was a way to take one of those problems off the board. Not completely, right? In terms of you had a negotiated way to take the region's, the Middle East's probably most central security problem and significantly downgrade it. Not get rid of it completely, right? Because yes, the Iran nuclear deal didn't solve all the problems, but it solved the real big one. Or at least it at least bought time for it. And I think that when it comes to how do you think about Iran in this new great power relationship or arrangement, I think we need to think very seriously about taking the non-maximal, but take what you can get when it comes to a place like Iran and when it comes to a place like North Korea, in terms of how can we essentially relatively stabilize these two places so that way the United States can focus more effort and attention on Russia and China. Because if you don't have that, right? Like if you don't have an Iran nuclear deal, if you don't have any kind of constraints on the Iranian nuclear program or on the North Korean nuclear program, then yes, you have China and Russia as the big problems, and you also have these two other regional nuclear problems that are also drawing attention. And at a certain point, resources and time are finite, and you just can't deal with all of them. So that would be my advice.
Yeah,
see the Iran deal as a pathway to taking that one problem and dialing it back.
I understand Dr. Eric Gomez's point. I think the challenge here is that you're not really sure that it will dial it back. In other words, if you drop the sanctions on Iran, the amount of money Iran would have at its disposal to fund Shia militias that are currently carrying out operations from Yemen to, parts of Iraq and certainly in Syria and Lebanon. The problem is it's sort of a trade-off. You presume that you've cut the agitation on the part of the Ayatollahs, but you've only done it for a short period of time because the agreement has an end date because the Iranians weren't willing to keep it open-ended. You're not impacting their ability to work out a solution to their race to ICBMs. They continue to build those, but now they would have more in the way of funding. as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, these are intercontinental ballistic missiles. That means from there to here. And his point was, yes, we know they say that Israel is a one-bomb country, but they call Israel the little Satan. The Ayatollah calls us the great Satan. And then lastly, you have the sheer amount of money that could go into the Quds forces and the IRGC. So you're trying for a while to get acquiescence, and you're saying they won't come up with the final turn of the screw, but the day will be here when, basically that agreement is eclipsed, and during the agreement, we're not able to go on any of their military institutions. It wasn't for lack of effort on our part to try to negotiate an agreement where we could get verification. But as long as they can do studies, research, tests on their military properties, we can't really know what advance we're making. There's no doubt it is a very complicated situation. My initial, and Elliot Engel, my Democratic counterpart, had initially pushed legislation for maximum sanctions like what you see on Russia right now that the world is deploying. That was blocked during the Obama administration. Then they moved forward with the agreement. My initial reaction was to let the agreement stand at that point. But the more I think about it, there are so many downsides given that their behavior, instead of showing even an intent to try to signal that they're going to shift back. I'm just concerned of anything that would smack of appeasement, because at this point, I don't think it's worked well for the West. And my real hope is that Putin is stopped in his tracks and that we get better at getting information into that Persian society, into that society that matches up with their sense of their identity and history and their own desire for freedom of speech, and the younger generation's desire for a more liberal, ability to live their lives in ways that are repressed. That perhaps, in my view, is the best way forward. We will see.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Any other comments? No? Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. I'm going to turn this over to Owen, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Dr. O'Regan. I think this has been a fantastic program. We will do it again very soon. We're going to be planning these in the future. I'd like you to go to our website, www.fullerton.edu/Royce Symposium. Add your name to the mailing list. Tell your friends and family. Get them signed up so you can know what we're going to be doing. But I'd like to thank our panelists for the discussions. The keynote, Dr. Carafano, Ed, and the rest of the panel, outstanding. I thank Schools First for their support. Thank you, Bill and Chrissy, for being here. And have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for being here.